there's a recognition that things have to change, and there has to be a multiplicity of approaches. One hopes gently and peacefully competing strategies that reflect national and regional interests.
Hello, this is the Weekly Tradecast, a podcast brought to you by UN Trade and Development. I'm Sarah Toms. We're exploring how major events are shaping trade and development and how that affects billions of people around the world. This week, we're looking at how we can bridge inequality in the global economy and create a fairer and more inclusive system with special guest James Galbraith. In recent decades, the economic centre of gravity has been shifting with the growing presence of big developing countries on the world stage. But many gaps and inequalities persist, just as climate change, rapid changes in technology and major shifts in geopolitics are transforming the way we live and reshaping the future of our planet. With so much to deal with, what are the priorities so that developing countries can be resilient and prosperous? And are we even on the right track to a more sustainable and inclusive future? Well, for context on those big questions, we welcome economist James Galbraith, who is a professor at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs and the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. The views in this episode are those of the guest. Well, welcome to the show, James.
Thank you very much.
Now, from where we sit today, do you feel that the economic promise of the last 60 years has been realised?
No, I think clearly it has not been, at least for large parts of the population of the world. So a new direction will be required. Now, in that time, certain parts of the world have, in fact, undergone massive amounts of economic development, largely by charting their own course. And that's certainly been true preeminently of China, but it was also true of East Asia in the 70s and 80s, as it had been true of Western Europe in the 50s. So we have alternative models, and the question going forward is to permit, first of all, diversity of approaches and implement them in a way which is respectful of the actual priorities and interests of the developing countries.
How are the risks changing, and what are the policies or systems or actions that we need to deal with all this?
A principal risk to any form of change is resistance by those whose interests are threatened. Now, what did the neoliberal era consolidated the powers of global finance. It consolidated, in particular, certain sort of league structures, and largely in the United States, to some extent Europe. And these forces are now running into a great deal of well-justified resistance. That's a recognition that it's not operating in the interest of the world's population as a whole. So there's a requirement for wisdom amongst the wealthy countries, which is, let's just say, not a guaranteed result of the changes that in fact have already occurred.
What disappoints you most about the trends in trade and development now, and what are you most encouraged for the future?
In trade and in development, there has been a certain ideological rigidity. Open capital markets is another doctrine, which in fact doesn't even have the imprimatur of the IMF charter. And it now seems to me clear that the tide has turned on that. There's a recognition that things have to change, and there has to be a multiplicity of approaches and a multiplicity of, one hopes, gently and peacefully competing strategies that reflect national and regional interests.
With so many competing priorities, as you said, for attention and investment, how can countries drive the growth while also ensuring that development is equitable and sustainable?
I do a great deal of work that's sort of very basic statistical work on the measurement of economic inequalities. And what we observe is that the countries which have actually some of the best performance in the world have maintained their social structures to be, let's just say, reasonably egalitarian. Egalitarianism is not an absolute value, but the point about inequality is that it has to be kept under control. It's obviously inevitable that there will be some, but when you keep it under control, that tends to have the effect of improving economic performance generally. So that it's consistent with a strategy of stable and sustainable economic development, and consistent with a strategy of social stability as well, which is hugely important. But we also observe that in China, where inequality rose dramatically in the reform period from the late 1980s onward, it has peaked and has begun to be brought under control. The same, by the way, also true in our observations in the Russian Federation. And what's going on here is a recognition that too much inequality, too much control by small numbers of people who have excessive amounts of wealth to throw around, too much poverty, which has been aggressively reduced and indeed eliminated in China in recent years, that these things are dangerous. And that if you keep those two extremes under control, then you have the possibility of maintaining a society which has, let's just say, some common purpose, common identity, forward momentum. This was, by the way, characteristic in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. It was the reason why the United States was an attractive model to much of the world. Well, in the 40 years of neoliberalism, things have changed in the United States, and that dimension of American appeal, of course, is greatly eroded, which is a terrible shame.
Where is the balance then between the state and the market, and how best do states and the private sector work together, and also with multilateral agencies?
Yeah. The argument I would make is that there's no complex market without a regulatory body, which is typically a state, to manage it and keep it from melting down, blowing up, eroding. I mean, the fact is, if we didn't have food and safety regulations, we would not eat raw vegetables. If we didn't have air traffic control, we would not fly in airplanes. And in the financial sector, if we don't regulate the banks, they are taken over by reckless or even criminal elements, and the financial system explodes and melts down. And we've seen this happen. So in order to have markets that functioned in a way that's broadly acceptable if people are prepared to use them, you have to have an appropriate regulatory authority. This is the essence of economic development. It's not so much technology. You can put technology anywhere. Education is important, but there are lots of very well-educated people in poor countries. It's the capacity to get things working together in an appropriate way and to have them functioning smoothly so that people understand the advantages of doing it that way. That's a regulatory process. And by the way, I said inequality, the control of inequality is a sort of at the highest level of abstraction is a very similar thing. You maintain an appropriate degree of inequality, and the society functions better than if you let it just be determined by whatever forces will play without any control.
Where do you think the best opportunities are for developing countries, and how can they be built up? So what can they do on their own, and where do they need the most support?
And the center of gravity of the world's economy has shifted away from, certainly from Europe, North America to some degree, and toward countries that 20 or 30 or 50 years ago we described as developing. The largest economy in the world today, purchasing power parity, is China. The third largest is India. The fourth largest is the Russian Federation. So amongst formerly G7 countries, the United States and Japan are the only two on the top 5 list. So in some sense, we are going to see, whether we like it or approve of it or don't approve of it, that there is multipolarity, that countries that previously were thinking, okay, we're the global south, you're the global north, what can you do for us, are going to be saying, no, we really are the center of gravity of the world economy, and we will set the terms on which our partners are able to develop. And one hopes that they will do so in a way that's pragmatic, non-ideological, effective, fair. The example of disaffection that occurs when a country which has the responsibility for stewardship of the whole global economy does not use that responsibility in a responsible manner, but abuses it in a way that's predatory, militaristic, or overly deferential to financial power, suggests that whatever comes along next will have a lot of appeal by being non-militaristic and keeping the financial aspects under very good control.
What should the markers of prosperity and progress be in the future? And what do you hope can be achieved in the next 60 years?
At this point, we're in a very dangerous moment, and the attention needs to be paid to the pathways to a sustainable and durable peace. That peace is going to require acknowledging the changes that are occurring. And so let's hope that the next 60 years are more realistic, less dogmatic, and more successful in important ways than the past 60 have been, or at least the past 40. I would like to see a general reorientation toward, let's say, the, first of all, peaceful expression and of diverse and divergent interests and strategies. I would like to see not just multipolarity, but heterogeneity of ideas, a true discussion of different perspectives in a respectful way, and a reemergence, in some respect, of trains of thought which were developed in past times. It's a big world. The countries are very diverse. They will necessarily do different things. They won't all follow the same path. But making those paths work together harmoniously is what an international organization has to really hold out.
Thank you to James Galbraith, who teaches at the University of Texas, for being this week's guest. Tune into the Weekly Tradecast next week and every week for more insights on the most pressing issues around the world of trade and development. And there's even more on our website, unctad.org. I'm Sarah Toms in Geneva. Goodbye for now.